Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And this is a continuation of Chapter 2. I began looking in my father's relatively modest library, which in those days seemed impressive to me, for books that would tell me what was known about God. At first, I found only the traditional conceptions, but not what I was seeking, a writer who thought independently. At last, I hit upon Biedermann's Christliche Dogmatik, published in 1869. Here, apparently, was a man who thought for himself, who worked out his own views. I learned from him that religion was, quote, a spiritual act consisting in man's establishing his own relationship to God. I disagreed with that, for I understood religion as something that God did to me. It was an act on his part, to which I must simply yield, for he was the stronger. My religion recognized no human relationship to God, for how could anyone relate to something so little known as God? I must know more about God in order to establish a relationship to him. In Biedermann's chapter on the nature of God, I found that God showed himself to be, quote, a personality to be conceived after the analogy of the human ego, the unique, utterly supramundane ego who embraces the entire cosmos. End quote. As far as I knew the Bible, this definition seemed to fit. God has a personality and is the ego of the universe, just as I myself am the ego of my psychic and my physical being. But here I encountered a formidable obstacle. Personality, after all, surely signifies character. Now, character is one thing and not another. That is to say, it involves certain specific attributes. But if God is everything, how can he still possess a distinguishable character? On the other hand, if he does have a character, he can only be the ego of a subjective, limited world. Moreover, what kind of character or what kind of personality does he have? Everything depends on that, for unless one knows the answer, one cannot establish a relationship to him. I felt the strongest resistances to imagining God by analogy with my own ego. That seemed to me boundlessly arrogant, if not downright blasphemous. My ego was, in any case, difficult enough for me to grasp. In the first place, I was aware that it consisted of two contradictory aspects, number one and number two. Second, in both its aspects, my ego was extremely limited, subject to all possible self-deceptions and errors, moods, emotions, passions, and sins. It suffered far more defeats than triumphs, was childish, vain, self-seeking, defiant, in need of love, covetous, unjust, sensitive, lazy, irresponsible, and so on. To my sorrow, it lacked many of the virtues and talents that I admired and envied in others. How could this be the analogy according to which we were meant to imagine the nature of God? Eagerly, I looked up the other characteristics of God and found them all listed in the way familiar to me from my instructions for confirmation. I found that according to Article 172, the most immediate expression of the supramundane nature of God is, number one, negative, his invisibility to men, etc., and two, positive, his dwelling in heaven, etc. This was disastrous, for at once there rushed to my mind the blasphemous vision which God directly or indirectly, i.e. via the devil, had imposed on my will. Article 183 informed me that, quote, God's supramundane nature with regard to the moral world, end quote, consists in his justice, which is not merely judicial, but also an expression of his holy being. I had hoped that this paragraph would say something about God's dark aspects, which were giving me so much trouble. His vindictiveness, his dangerous wrathfulness, his incomprehensible conduct towards the creatures his omnipotence had made, whose inadequacies he must know by virtue of that same omnipotence, and whom, moreover, it pleased him to lead astray, or at least to test, even though he knew in advance the outcome of his experiments. What indeed was God's character? What would we say of a human personality who behaved in this manner? I did not dare to think this question out to its conclusion, and then I read that God, quote, although sufficient unto himself and needing nothing outside himself, had created the world out of his satisfaction, and as a natural world had filled as a natural world has filled it with his goodness, and as a moral world desires to fill it with his love. At first I pondered over the perplexing word satisfaction. Satisfaction? With what? Or with whom? Obviously with the world, for he had looked upon his work and called it good. But it was just this that I had never understood. Certainly the world is immeasurably beautiful, but it is quite as horrible. In a small village, in the country, where there are few people and nothing much happens, old age, disease, and death are experienced more intensely, in greater detail, and more nakedly than elsewhere. Although I was not yet 16 years old, I had seen a great deal of the reality of the life of a man and beast, and in church and school I had heard enough of the sufferings and the corruptions of the world. God could at most have felt satisfaction with paradise, but then he himself had taken good care that the glory of paradise should not last too long by planting in it that poisonous serpent, the devil. Had he taken satisfaction in that too? I felt that Biederman did not mean this, but was simply babbling on in that mindless way that characterized religious instruction, not even aware that he was writing nonsense. As I saw it, it was not at all unreasonable to suppose that God, for all that he probably did not feel any such cruel satisfaction in the unmerited sufferings of man and beast, had nevertheless intended to create a world of contradictions in which one creature devoured another, and life meant simply being born to die. The wonderful harmonies of natural law looked to me more like chaos, tamed by fearful effort, and the eternal starry firmament, with its predetermined orbits, seemed plainly an accumulation of random bodies without order or meaning. For no one could really see the constellations that people spoke about. They were merely arbitrary configurations. I either did not see or gravely doubted that God filled the natural world with his goodness. This apparently was another one of those points which must not be reasoned about, but must be believed. In fact, if God is the highest good, why is the world, his creation, so imperfect, so corrupt, so pitiable? Obviously, it has been infected and thrown into confusion by the devil, I thought. But the devil, too, was a creature of God. I had to read up on the devil. He seemed to be a seemed to be highly important after all. I again opened Biederman's book on Christian dogmatics and looked for the answer to this burning question. What were the reasons for suffering, imperfection, and evil? I could find nothing. That finished it for me. This weighty tome on dogmatics was nothing but fancied drivel. Worse still, it was a fraud or a specimen of uncommon stupidity whose sole aim was to obscure the truth. I was disillusioned and even indignant, and once more seized with pity for my father who had fallen victim to all this mumbo-jumbo. But somewhere and at some time there must have been people who sought the truth as I was doing, and who thought rationally and did not wish to deceive themselves and others and deny the sorrowful reality of the world. It was about this time that my mother, or rather her number 2 personality, suddenly and without preamble said, "You must read Goethe's Faust one of these days." We had a handsome edition of Goethe, and I picked out Faust. It poured into my soul like a miraculous balm. Here at last, I thought, is someone who takes the devil seriously and even concludes a blood pact with him, with the adversary who has the power to frustrate God's plan to make a perfect world. I regretted Faust's behavior, for to my mind, he should not have been so one-sided and so easily tricked. He should have been cleverer and also more moral. How childish he was to gamble away his soul so frivolously. Faust was plainly a bit of windbag. Faust was plainly a bit of a windbag. I had the impression that the weight of the drama and its significance lay chiefly on the side of Mephistopheles. It would not have grieved me if Faust's soul had gone to hell. He deserved it. I did not like the idea of the cheated devil at the end, for after all, Mephistopheles had been anything but a stupid devil, and was contrary to logic for him to be tricked by silly little angels. Mephistopheles seemed to me cheated in quite a different sense. He had not received his promised rights because Faust, that somewhat characterless fellow, had carried his swindle through right to the hereafter. There, admittedly, his puerility came to light, but as I saw it, he did not deserve the initiation into the great mysteries. I would have given him a taste of purgatorial fires. The real problem, it seemed to me, lay with Mephistopheles, whose whole figure made the deepest impression on me, and who, I vaguely sensed, had a relationship to the mystery of the mothers. At any rate, he and the great initiation at the end remained for me a wonderful and mysterious experience on the fringes of my conscious world. At last I had found confirmation that there were or had been people who saw evil and its universal power, and more important, the mysterious role it played in delivering man from darkness and suffering. To the extent Goethe became, in my eyes, a prophet. But I could not forgive him for having dismissed Mephistopheles by a mere trick, by a bit of jiggery-pokery. Jiggery-pokery. For me, that was too theological, too frivolous and irresponsible, and I was deeply sorry that Goethe, too, had fallen for those cunning devices by which evil is rendered innocuous. In reading the drama, I had discovered that Faust had been a philosopher of sorts, and although he turned away from philosophy, he had obviously learned from it a certain receptivity to the truth. Hitherto, I had heard virtually nothing of philosophy, and now a new hope dawned. Perhaps, I thought, there were philosophers who had grappled with these questions and could shed light on them for me. Since there were no philosophers in my father's library, they were suspect because they thought. I had to content myself with Krug's, K-R-U-G, Krug's General Dictionary of the Philosophical Sciences, 2nd edition, 1932. I plunged forthwith into the article on God. To my discontent, it began with the etymology of the word God, which, it said, incontestably derived from good and signified the ens, summons, or perfectissimum. All right. The existence of God could not be proved, it continued, nor the innateness of the idea of God. The latter, however, could exist a priori in man, if not in actuality, at any case potentially. In any case, our intellectual powers must already be developed to a certain degree before they're capable of engendering so sublime an idea. This explanation astounded me beyond measure. What is wrong with these philosophers, I wondered. Evidently, they know of God only by hearsay. The theologians are different in this respect, at any rate. At least, they are sure that God exists, even though they make contradictory statements about him. This lexicographer, Krug, expresses himself in so involved a manner that it's easy to see he would like to assert that he is already sufficiently convinced of God's existence. Then, why doesn't he say so outright? Why does he pretend as if he really thought that we engender the idea of God, and to do so must have first reached a certain level of development? So far as I knew, even the savages wandering naked in their jungles had such ideas, and they were certainly not philosophers who sat down to engender an idea of God. I never engendered any idea of God either. Of course, God cannot be proved, for how could, say, a clothes moth that exists Australian wool prove to other moths that Australia exists? God's existence does not depend on our proofs. How had I arrived at my certainty about God? I was told all sorts of things about him, yet I could believe nothing. None of it convinced me. That was not where my idea came from. In fact, it was not an idea at all. That is, not something thought out. It was not like imagining something, thinking it out, and afterwards believing it. For example, all that about Lord Jesus was always suspect to me, and I never really believed it, although it was impressed upon me far more than God, who was usually only hinted at in the background. Why have I come to take God for granted? Why do these philosophers pretend that God is an idea, a kind of arbitrary assumption, which they can engender or not, when it's perfectly clear that he exists as plain as a brick that falls on your head? Suddenly, I understood that God was, for me at least, one of the most certain and immediate of experiences. After all, I didn't invent that horrible image about the cathedral. On the contrary, it was forced on me, and I was compelled with the utmost cruelty to think it. And afterwards, that inexpressible feeling of grace came to me. I had no control over these things. I came to the conclusion that there must be something the matter with these philosophers, for they had the curious notion that God was a kind of hypothesis that could be discussed. I found it extremely unsatisfying that the philosophers offered no opinions or explanations about the dark deeds of God. These, it seemed to me, merited special attention and consideration from philosophy, since they constituted a problem which I gathered was rather a hard one for the Theologians. All the greater was my disappointment to discover that the philosophers had apparently never even heard of it. I therefore passed on to the next topic that interested me, the article on the devil. If I read, we conceived of the devil as originally evil, we would have become entangled in patent contradictions. That is to say, we would fall into dualism. Therefore, we would do better to assume that the devil was originally created a good being but had been corrupted by his pride. However, as the author of the article pointed out, and I was glad to see this point made, this hypothesis presupposed the devil. This hypothesis presupposed the evil it was attempting to explain, namely pride. For the rest, he continued, the origin of evil was unexplained and inexplicable, which meant to me, like the theologians did not want to think about it. The article on evil and its origin proved equally unilluminating. The accounts I have given here summarizes trains of thoughts and development of ideas which, broken by long intervals, extended over several years. They went on exclusively in my number 2 personality and were strictly private. I used my father's library for these researches secretly and without his permission. In the intervals, personality number 1 openly read all the novels of Goethe and the German translations of the classic English novels. I also began reading German literature, concentrating on those classics which school, with its needlessly laborious explanations of the obvious, had not spoiled for me. I read vastly and planlessly drama, poetry, history, and later natural science. Reading was not only interesting but proved a welcome and beneficial distraction from the preoccupations of personality number 2, which in increasing measure were leading me to depressions. For everywhere in the realm of religious questions I encountered only locked doors, and if ever one door should chance to open, I was disappointed by what lay behind it. Other people all seemed to have totally different concerns. I felt completely alone with my certainties. More than ever, I wanted someone to talk with, but nowhere did I find a point of contact. On the contrary, I sensed in others an estrangement, a distrust, an apprehension, which robbed me of speech. That too depressed me. I did not know what to make of it. Why has no one had experiences similar to mine, I wondered. Why is there nothing about it in scholarly books? Am I the only one who's had such experiences? Why should I be the only one? Never occurred to me that I might be crazy, for the light and the darkness of God seemed to me facts that could be understood even though they oppressed my feelings. I felt the singularity into which I was being forced as something threatening, for it meant isolation, and that seemed all the more unpleasant to me, as I was unjustly taken for a scapegoat a good deal more than I liked. Moreover, something had happened in the school to increase my isolation. In the German class, I was rather mediocre, for the subject matter, especially German grammar and syntax, did not interest me at all. I was lazy and bored. The subjects for composition usually seemed to me shallow or silly, and my essays turned out accordingly, either careless or labored. I slipped through with average marks, and this suited me very well, as it fitted in with my general tendency not to be conspicuous. On the whole, I sympathized with boys from poor families who, like myself, had come from nowhere and had a liking for those who were none too bright, though I tended to become excessively irritated by their stupidity and ignorance. For the fact of the matter was that they had something to offer, which I craved deeply. In their simplicity, they noticed nothing unusual about me. Their usualness was gradually beginning to give me the disagreeable, rather uncanny feeling that I must possess repulsive traits of which I was not aware, that caused my teachers and schoolmates to shun me. In the midst of these preoccupations, the following incident burst on me like a thunderclap. We had been assigned a subject for composition, which for once interested me. Consequently, I set to work with a will and produced what seemed to me a carefully written and successful paper. I hoped to receive at least one of the highest marks for it. Not the highest, of course, for that would have made me conspicuous, but one close to the top. Our teacher was in the habit of discussing the compositions in order of merit. The first one he turned to was the boy at the head of the class. That was all right. Then followed the compositions of the others. And I waited in vain for my name. Still, it did not come. It just can't be, I thought, that mine is so bad that it is even below these poor ones that he has come to. What can be the matter? What was I? Was I simply hors concours? HORSCONCOURS, which would mean being isolated and attracting attention in the most dreadful way of all. When all the essays had been read, the teacher paused, and then he said, "Now, I have one more composition, Jung's. It is by far the best, and I ought to have given it first place. But unfortunately, it is a fraud. Where did you copy it from? Confess the truth." I shot to my feet, as horrified as I was furious, and I cried, "I did not copy it. I went to a lot of trouble to write a good composition." But the teacher shouted at me, "You are lying. You could never write a composition like that. No one is going to believe that. Now, where did you copy it from?" Vainly, I swore to my innocence. The teacher clung to his theory. He became threatening. "I can tell you this. If I knew where you had copied it from, you would be chucked out of the school." And he turned away. My classmates threw odd glances at me, and I realized with horror what they were thinking. "Aha! So that's the way, is it?" My protestations fell on deaf ears. I felt that from now on I was branded, and that all the paths which might have led me out of the unusualness had been cut off. Profoundly disheartened and dishonored, I swore vengeance on the teacher, and if I had had an opportunity, something straight out of the law of the jungle would have resulted. How in the world could I possibly prove that I had not copied the essay? For days I turned this incident over in my thoughts, and again, and I came to the conclusion that I was powerless. The sport of a blind and stupid fate had marked me as a liar and a cheat, and now I realized many things I had not previously understood. For example, how it was that one of my teachers could say to my father, who had inquired about my conduct in school, "Oh, he's just average, but he works commendably hard." I was thought to be relatively stupid and superficial. That did not annoy me, really, but what made me furious was that they should think me capable of cheating and thus morally destroy me. My grief and rage threatened to get out of control. And then something happened that I had already observed in myself several times before. There was a sudden inner silence, as though a soundproof door had been closed on a noisy room. It was as if a mood of cool curiosity came over me, and I asked myself, what is really going on here? All right, you are excited. Of course the teacher's an idiot who doesn't understand your nature, that is, doesn't understand it any more than you do. Therefore, he is as mistrustful as you are. You distrust yourself and others, and that is why you side with those who are naive, simple, and easily seen through. One gets excited when one doesn't understand things. In the light of these considerations, I was struck by the analogy that another train of thoughts which had impressed itself on me so forcefully that I did not want to think the forbidden thought. Although at the time I doubtless saw no difference as yet between the personalities, number 1 and number 2, and still claimed the world of number 2 as my own personal world, there was always deep in my background the feeling that something other than myself was involved. It was as though a breath of the great world of stars and endless space had touched me, or as if a spirit had invisibly entered the room, the spirit of one who had been long dead and yet was perpetually presenting timelessness until far into the future. At that time, of course, I could never have expressed myself in this fashion, nor am I now attributing to my state of consciousness something that was not there at the time. I'm only trying to express the feelings I had then and to shed light on that twilight world with the help of what I now know. It was some months after the incident just described that my schoolmates hung the nickname Father Abraham on me. Number 1 could not understand why and thought it silly and ridiculous. Yet somewhere in the background, I felt that the name had hit the mark. All allusions to this background were painful to me, for the more I read and the more familiar I became with city life, the stronger grew my impression that I was getting to know that what I was getting to know as reality belonged to an order of things different from the world of the view of the world that I had grown up with in the country, among rivers and woods, among men and animals, in a small village bathed by sunlight, with the winds and the clouds moving over it, and encompassed by dark night, in which uncertain things happened. It was no mere locality on the map, but God's world, so ordered by Him and filled with secret meaning. It was no mere locality on the map, but God's world, so ordered by Him and filled with secret meaning. But apparently men did not know this. Even the animals had somehow lost the senses to perceive it. That was evident, for example, in the sorrowful lost look of the cows, and in the resigned eyes of the horses, in the devotion of the dogs who clung so desperately to human beings, and even in the self-assured step of the cats who had chosen house and barn as their residence and hunting ground. People were like the animals and seemed as unconscious as they. They looked down upon the ground or up into the trees to see what could be put to use and for what purpose. Like animals, they herded, they paired, they fought, but they did not see that they dwelt in a unified cosmos, in God's world, in an eternity where everything is already born and everything has already died. Because they are so closely akin to us and share our unknowingness, I loved all warm-blooded animals who have souls like ourselves, and with whom, so I thought, we have an instinctive understanding. We experience joy and sorrow, love and hate, hunger and thirst, fear and trust, in common. All the essential features of existence, with the exception of speech, sharpened consciousness, and science. And although I admired science in the conventional way, I also saw it giving rise to alienation and aberration from God's world, as leading to a degeneration which animals were not capable of. Animals were dear and faithful, unchanging and trustworthy. People are now distrusted more than ever. Insects I did not regard as proper animals, and I took cold-blooded vertebrates to be rather lowly intermediate stages on the way down to the insects. Creatures in this category were objects for observation and collection, curiosities merely alien and extra-human. They were manifestations of impersonal life and more akin to plants than to human beings. The earthly manifestations of God's world began with the realm of plants as a kind of direct communication from it. It was as though we were peering over the shoulder of the Creator, who, thinking himself unobserved, was making toys and decorations. Man and the proper animals, on the other hand, were bits of God that had become independent. That was why they could move about on their own and choose their abodes. Plants were bound for good or ill to their places. They expressed not only the beauty, but also the thoughts of God's world, with no intent of their own and without deviation. Trees, in particular, were mysterious and, seemed to me, direct embodiments of the incomprehensible meaning of life. For that reason, the woods were the place where I felt closest to its deepest meaning and to its awe-inspiring workings. This impression was reinforced when I became acquainted with Gothic cathedrals. But there, the infinity of the cosmos, the chaos of the meaning and meaninglessness, the chaos of meaning and meaninglessness, of impersonal purpose and mechanical law, were wrapped in stone. This contained, and at the same time was, the bottomless mystery of being, the embodiment of spirit. What I dimly felt to be my kinship with stone was the divine nature in both, in the dead and in the living matter. At that time, it would, as I have said, it would have been beyond my powers to formulate my feelings and intuitions in any graphic way, for they had all occurred in number 2 personality, while my active and comprehending ego remained passive and absorbed into the sphere of the old man who belonged to the centuries. I experienced him and his influence in a curiously unreflective manner. When he was present, number 1 personality paled to the point of non-existence, and when the ego that became increasingly identical with number 1 personality dominated the scene, the old man, if remembered at all, seemed a remote and unreal dream. Between my 16th and 19th years, the fog of my dilemma slowly lifted and my depressive states of mind improved. Number 1 personality emerged more and more distinctly. School and city life took up my time, and my increased knowledge gradually permeated or repressed the world of intuitive premonitions. My increased knowledge gradually permeated or repressed the world of intuitive premonitions. I began systematically enough to know that I was only gradually, as it were, distinguishing myself from an animal. Schopenhauer's somber picture of the world had my undivided approval, but not his solution of the problem. I felt sure that by will, W-I-L, He meant God, the Creator, and that he was saying that God was blind, since I knew from experience that God was not offended by any blasphemy, that on the contrary, he could even encourage it, because he wished to evoke not only man's bright and positive side, but also his darkness and ungodliness. Schopenhauer's view did not distress me. I considered it a verdict justified by the facts. But I was all the more disappointed by his theory that the intellect need only confront the blind will with its image in order to cause it to reverse itself. How could the will see this image at all, since it was blind? And why should it, even if it could see, thereby be persuaded to reverse itself, since the image would show itself precisely what it willed? And what was the intellect? It was a function of the human soul, not a mirror, but an infinitesimal fragment of a mirror, such as a child might hold up to the sun, expecting the sun to be dazzled by it. I was puzzled that Schopenhauer should ever have been satisfied with such an inadequate answer. Because of this, I was impelled to study him more thoroughly, and I became increasingly impressed by his relationship to Kant. I therefore began reading the works of this philosopher, above all his critique of pure reason, which put me to some hard thinking. My efforts were rewarded, for I discovered the fundamental flaw, or so I thought, in Schopenhauer's system. He had committed the deadly sin of hypostatizing. Maybe there's a typo here. I don't know, I can't read this word. A metaphysical assertion, and of endowing a mere Numen Ding an sich, with special qualities. I got this from Kant's theory of knowledge, and it afforded me an even greater illumination, if that were possible, than Schopenhauer's pessimistic view of the world. This philosophical development extended from my 17th year until well into the period of my medical studies. It brought about a revolutionary alteration of my attitude to the world and to life. Whereas formerly I had been shy, timid, mistrustful, pallid, thin, and apparently unstable in health, I now began to display a tremendous appetite on all fronts. I knew what I wanted, and I went after it. I also became noticeably more accessible and more communicative. I discovered that poverty was no handicap, and was far from being the principal reason for suffering, that the sons of the rich did not really enjoy any advantages over the poor and ill-clad boys. There were far deeper reasons for happiness and unhappiness than one's allotment of pocket money. I made more and better friends than before. I felt firmer ground under my feet, and even summoned up the courage to speak openly of my ideas. But that, as I discovered all too soon, was a misunderstanding which I had cause to regret. For I met not only with embarrassment of mockery, but with hostile rejection. To my consternation and discomfiture, I found that certain people considered me a braggart, a poser, and a humbug. The old charge of cheat was revived, even though in a somewhat milder form. Once again, it had to do with a subject for composition that had aroused my interest. I had worked out a paper with particular care, taking the greatest pains to polish my style. The result was crushing. "Here's an essay by Jung," said the teacher. "It is downright brilliant, but tossed off so carelessly that it is easy to see how little serious effort went into it. I can tell you this, Jung. You won't get through life with that slapdash attitude. Life calls for earnestness and conscientiousness, work and effort. Look at Dee's paper. He has none of your brilliance, but he is honest, conscientious, and hardworking. That is the way to success in life. My feelings were not as hurt as on the first occasion, for in spite of himself, the teacher had been impressed by my essay and had at least not accused me of stealing it. I protested against his reproaches, but was dismissed with the comment, "The Ars Poetica maintains that the best poem is the one which conceals the effort of creation, but you cannot make me believe that about your essay, for it was tossed off frivolously and without any effort." There were, I knew, a few good ideas in it, but the teacher did not even bother to discuss them. I felt some bitterness over this incident, but the suspicions of my schoolmates were a far more serious matter, for they threatened to throw me back into my former isolation and depression. I racked my brains trying to understand what I could have done to deserve their slanders. By cautious inquiries, I discovered that they looked askance at me because I often made remarks or dropped hints about things which I could not possibly know. For instance, I pretended to know something about Kant and Schopenhauer and about paleontology, which we had not even had in school yet. These astonishing discoveries showed to me practically all the burning questions had nothing to do with everyday life, but belonged, like my ultimate secret, to God's world, which it was better not to speak of. Henceforth, I took care not to mention these esoteric matters among my schoolmates, and among adults of my acquaintances, I knew no one with whom I might have talked without risk of being thought a boaster, an impostor. The most painful thing of all was the frustration of my attempts to overcome the inner split in myself, my division into two worlds. Again and again events occurred which forced me out of my ordinary everyday existence into the boundlessness of God's world. This expression, God's world, may sound sentimental to some ears. For me, it did not have this character at all. To God's world belonged everything superhuman: dazzling light, the darkness of the abyss, the cold impassivity of infinite space and time, the uncanny grotesqueness of the irrational world of chance. God, for me, was everything, and anything but edifying. The older I grew, the more frequently I was asked by my parents and others what I wanted to be. I had no clear notions on that score. My interests drew me in different directions. On the one hand, I was powerfully attracted by science and its truths based on facts. On the other hand, I was fascinated by everything to do with comparative religion. In the sciences, I was drawn principally to zoology, paleontology, and geology. In the humanities, to Greco-Roman, Egyptian, and prehistoric archaeology. At that time, of course, I did not realize how very much this choice of the most varied subjects corresponded to the nature of my own inner dichotomy. What appealed to me in science were the concrete facts and their historical background, and in comparative religion, in the spiritual problems, into which philosophy also entered. In science, I missed the factor of meaning, and in religion, that of empiricism. Science met, to a very large extent, the needs of personality number one, whereas the humane or historical studies provides beneficial instruction for number two. Torn between these two poles, I was for a long time unable to settle on anything. I noticed that my uncle, the head of my mother's family, who was pastor at St. Albans in Basel, was gently pushing me in the direction of theology. The usual attentiveness with which I had followed a conversation at table when he was discussing a point of religion with one of his sons, all of whom were theologians, had not escaped him. I wondered whether there might possibly be theologians who were in close touch with the dizzy heights of the university and therefore knew more than my father. Such conversations never gave me the impression that they were concerned with real experiences, certainly not with experiences like mine. They dealt exclusively with doctrinal opinions on the biblical narratives, all of which made me feel distinctly uncomfortable because of their numerous and barely credible accounts of miracles. While I was attending the gymnasium, I was allowed to lunch at this uncle's house every Thursday. I was grateful to him, not only for the lunch, but for the unique opportunity of occasionally hearing at his table an adult, intelligent, and intellectual conversation. It was a marvelous experience for me to discover that anything of this sort existed at all, for in my home surroundings I had never heard anyone discussing learned topics. I did sometimes attempt to talk seriously with my father, but encountered an impatience and anxious defensiveness which puzzled me. Not until several years later did I come to understand that my poor father did not dare to think, because he was consumed by inward doubts. He was taking refuge from himself, and therefore insisted on blind faith. He could not receive it as a grace because he wanted to win it by struggle, forcing it to come with convulsive efforts. My uncle and my cousins could calmly discuss the dogmas and the doctrines of the church fathers and the opinions of the modern theologians. They seemed safely ensconced in a self-evident world order in which the name of Nietzsche did not occur at all, and Jacob Burckhardt was paid only a grudging compliment. Burckhardt was liberal, rather too much of a freethinker. I gathered that he stood somewhat askew in the eternal order of things. My uncle I knew never suspected how remote I was from theology, and I was deeply sorry to have to disappoint him. I would never have dared to lay my problems before him, since I knew only too well how disastrously this could turn out for me. I had nothing to say in my defense. On the contrary, number one personality was fast taking the lead, and my scientific knowledge, though still meager, was thoroughly saturated with the scientific materialism of the time. It was only painfully held in check by the evidence of history and by Kant's critique of pure reason, which apparently nobody in my environment understood, for although Kant was mentioned by my theologian uncle and cousins in tones of praise, his principles were used only to discredit opposing views, but were never applied to their own. About this, too, I said nothing. Consequently, I began to feel more and more uncomfortable when I sat down to table with my uncle and his family. Given my habitually guilty conscience, these Thursdays became black days for me. In this world of social and spiritual security and ease, I felt less and less at home, although I thirsted for the drops of intellectual stimulation which occasionally trickled forth. I felt dishonest and ashamed. I had to admit to myself, yes, you are a cheat, you lie, and you deserve people who mean well by you. No, and you deceive people, who mean well by you. It's not their fault that they live in a world of social and intellectual certitudes, that they know nothing of poverty, that their religion is also their paid profession, and that they are totally unconscious of the fact that God himself can wrench a person out of his orderly spiritual world and condemn him to blaspheme. I have no way of explaining this to them. I must take the odium on myself and learn to bear it. Unfortunately, I had so far been singularly unsuccessful in this endeavor. As the tensions of this moral conflict increased, number 2 personality became more and more doubtful and distasteful to me, and I could no longer hide this fact from myself. I tried to extinguish number 2, but could not succeed in that either. At school and in the presence of my friends, I could not forget him, and he also disappeared when I was studying science. But as soon as I was by myself, at home, or out in the country, Schopenhauer and Kant returned in full force, and with them the grandeur of God's world. My scientific knowledge also formed a part of it, and filled the great canvas with vivid colors and figures. Then, number 1, in his worries about the choice of a profession, sank below the horizon, a tiny episode in the last decade of the 19th century. But when I returned from my expedition into the centuries, I brought with me a kind of hangover. I, or rather number 1, lived in the here and now, and sooner or later I would have to form a definite idea of what profession he wished to pursue. Several times my father had a serious talk with me. I was free to study anything I liked, he said, but if I wanted his advice, I should keep away from theology. Be anything you like except a theologian, he said emphatically. By this time, there was a tacit agreement between us that certain things could be said or done without comment. He had never taken me to task for cutting church as often as possible and for not going to communion anymore. The farther away I was from the church, the better I felt. The only things I missed were the organ and the choral music, but certainly not the religious community. The phrase meant nothing to me at all, for the habitual churchgoers struck me as being far less of a community than the worldly folk. The latter may have been less virtuous, but on the other hand, they were much nicer people, with natural emotions, more sociable and cheerful, warm-hearted, and more sincere. I was able to reassure my father that I had not the slightest desire to be a theologian. I continued to waver between science and the humanities. Both powerfully attracted me. I was beginning to realize that number 2 had no pied-à-terre. In him, I was lifted beyond the here and now. In him, I felt myself a single eye in a 1,000-eyed universe, but incapable of moving so much as a pebble upon the earth. Number 1 rebelled against his passivity. He wanted to be up and doing, but for the present he was caught in an insoluble conflict. Obviously, I had to wait and see what would happen. If anyone asked me what I wanted to be, I was in the habit of replying, a philologist, by which I secretly meant a Syrian and Egyptian archaeologist. In reality, however, I continued to study science and philosophy in my leisure hours, and particularly during the holidays, which I spent at home with my mother and sister. The days were long past when I ran to my mother lamenting, "I'm bored and I don't know what to do." Holidays were now the best time of year, when I could amuse myself alone. Moreover, during the summer vacations at least, my father was away, as he used regularly to spend his holidays in Sachsen. 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 Only once did it happen that I too went on a vacation trip. I was 14 when on doctor's orders, I was sent to Entlebuch. I can't pronounce this. Entlebuch, for a cure, in the hope that my fitful appetite and my then unstable health would be improved. For the first time, I was alone among adult strangers. I was quartered in the Catholic priest's house. For me, this was an eerie and at times fascinating adventure. I seldom got a glimpse of the priest myself, and his housekeeper was scarcely an alarming person, though liable to be curt. Nothing in the least menacing happened to me. I was under the supervision of an old country doctor who ran a kind of hotel sanitarium for convalescents of all types. It was a very mixed group: farm people, minor officials, merchants, and a few cultivated people from Basel, among them a chemist who had attained a pinnacle of glory, the doctorate. My father, too, was a Ph.D., but he was merely a philologist and linguist. This chemist was a fascinating novelty to me. Here was a scientist, perhaps one of those who understood the secrets of stones. He was still a young man, and he taught me to play croquet, but he imparted to me none of his presumably vast learning, and I was too shy, too awkward, far too ignorant to ask him. I revered him as the first person I'd ever met in the flesh who was initiated into the secrets of nature, or some of them at least. He sat at the same table with me, ate the same food as I did, and occasionally even exchanged a few words with me. I felt transported into the sublimer sphere of adulthood. This elevation in my status was confirmed when I was permitted to go on outings arranged for the boarders. On one of these occasions, we visited a distillery, and we were invited to sample the wares. In literal fulfillment of the verse, "By now there comes a kicker, the stuff you see is liquor." I found the various little glasses so inspiring that I was wafted into an entirely new and unexpected state of consciousness. There was no longer any inside or outside, no longer an I, and the others, number one, number two, were no more. Caution and timidity were gone, and the earth and the sky, the universe and everything in it that creeps and flies, revolves, rises or falls, had all become one. I was shamefully, gloriously, triumphantly drunk. It was as if I were drowned in a sea of blissful musings. But because of the violent heavings of the waves, I had to cling with my eyes, hands, and feet to all solid objects in order to keep my balance on the swaying streets and between the rocking houses and trees. Marvelous, I thought, only unfortunately just a little too much. The experience came to a rather woeful end, but it nevertheless remained a discovery, a premonition of beauty and meaning, which I had spoiled only by my stupidity. At the end of my stay, my father came to fetch me, and we traveled together to Lucerne, where, what happiness, we went aboard a steamship. I had never seen anything like it. I could not see enough of the action of the steam engine, and then suddenly I was told we had arrived at Witzau. Above the village towered a high mountain, and my father now explained to me that this was the Rigi, R-I-G-I, and that a cogwheel railway ran up to it. We went to a small station building, and there stood the strangest locomotive in the world, with the boiler upright, but tilted at a queer angle. Even the seats in the carriage were tilted. My father pressed a ticket into my hand and said, "You can ride up to the peak alone. I'll stay here. It's too expensive for the two of us. Be careful not to fall down anywhere." I was speechless with joy. Here I was at the foot of this mighty mountain, higher than any I had ever seen, and quite close to the fiery peaks of my faraway childhood. I was indeed almost a man by now. For this trip, I had bought myself a bamboo cane and an English jockey cap, proper articles of dress for a world traveler, and now I was to ascend this enormous mountain. I no longer knew which was bigger, I or the mountain. With a tremendous puffing, the wonderful locomotive shook and rattled me up to the dizzy heights, wherever new abysses and panoramas opened out before my gaze, until at last I stood on the peak in the strange thin air and looked into the unimaginable distances. Yes, I thought, this is it. My world, the real world, the secret, where there are no teachers, no schools, no unanswerable questions, where one can be without having to ask anything. I kept carefully to the paths, for there were tremendous precipices all around. It was all very solemn, and I felt one had to be polite and silent up here, for one was in God's world. Here it was physically present. This was the best and the most precious gift my Father had ever given me. So profound was the impression this made upon me that my memories of everything that happened afterwards in God's world were completely blotted out. But number one also came into his own on this trip, and his impressions remained with me for the rest of my life. I still see myself grown up and independent, wearing a stiff black hat with an expensive cane, sitting on the terrace of one of the overwhelming, elegant palatial hotels beside Lake Lucerne, or in the beautiful gardens of Witznau, having my morning coffee at a small white-covered table with a striped awning spangled with sunlight, eating croissants with golden butter and various kinds of jam, and considering plans for outings that would fill the whole long summer day. After the coffee, I would stroll calmly, without excitement and at a deliberate pace, to a steamship which would carry me toward Gotthard and the foot of those giant mountains whose tops were covered with gleaming glaciers. For many decades, this image rose up whenever I was wearied from overwork and sought a point of rest. In real life, I have promised myself this splendor again and again, but I have never kept my promise. This was my first conscious journey, and it was followed by a second a year or two later. I had been allowed to visit my father, who was on holiday in Suchsen. From him, I learned the impressive news that he had become friendly with a Catholic priest there. This seemed to be an act of extraordinary boldness, and secretly I admired my father's courage. While there, I paid a visit to the hermitage of Fleur and the relics of Brother Klaus, who by then had been beatified. I wondered how the Catholics knew that he was in a beatific state. Perhaps he was still wandering about and had told people so. I was powerfully impressed by the genius loci, and was not able only to imagine the possibility of a life so entirely dedicated to God, but even to understand it. But I did so with an inward shudder and a question to which I knew no answer. How could his wife and children have borne having a saint for a husband and father, when it was precisely my father's faults and inadequacies that made him particularly lovable to me? Yes, I thought, how could anyone live with a saint? Obviously, he saw that it was impossible, and therefore he had to become a hermit. Still, it was not so very far from his cell to his house. This wasn't a bad idea, I thought, to have a family in one house, while I could live some distance away in a hut, with a pile of books and a writing table, and an open fire where I could roast chestnuts and cook my soup on a tripod. As a holy hermit, I wouldn't have to go to church anymore, but would have my own private chapel instead. From the hermitage, I strolled up on the hill, lost in my thoughts, and was just turning to descend when from the left, the slender figure of a young girl appeared. She wore a local costume, had a pretty face, and greeted me with friendly blue eyes, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. We descended into the valley together. She was about my own age. Since I knew no other girls except my cousins, I felt rather embarrassed and did not know how to talk to her, so I began hesitantly explaining that I was here for a couple of days on holiday, that I was at the gymnasium in Basel and later wanted to study at the university. While I was talking, a strange feeling of fatefulness crept over me. She has appeared just at this moment, I thought to myself, and she walks along with me as naturally as if we belonged together. I glanced sideways at her, and I saw an expression of mingled shyness and admiration in her face, which embarrassed me and somehow pierced me. Can it be possible, I wondered, that this is fate? Is my meeting her mere chance? A peasant girl? Could it possibly be? She is a Catholic, but perhaps her priest is the very one with whom my father has made friends. She has no idea who I am, and I certainly couldn't talk to her about Schopenhauer and the negation of the will, could I? Yet she doesn't seem in any way sinister. Perhaps her priest is not one of those Jesuits skulking about in black robes. But I cannot tell her either that my father is a Protestant clergyman, that might frighten or offend her, and to talk about philosophy or about the devil, who is more important than Faust, even though Goethe made such a simpleton of him, that is quite out of the question. She still dwells in the distant land of innocence. But I have plunged into reality, into the splendor and the cruelty of creation. How can she endure to hear about that? An impenetrable wall stands between us. There is not and cannot be any relationship. Sad at heart, I retreated into myself and turned the conversation to less dangerous topics. Was she going to Sachsen? Wasn't the weather lovely? And what a view, and so on. Outwardly, this encounter was completely meaningless. But seen from within, it was so weighty that it not only occupied my thoughts for days, but has remained forever in my memory, like a shrine by the wayside. At the time, I was still in that childlike state, where life consists of single, unrelated experiences. For who could discover the threads of fate which led from Brother Klaus to the pretty girl? This period of my life was filled with conflicting thoughts. Schopenhauer and Christianity would not square with one another, for one thing. And for another, number one wanted to free himself from the pressure or melancholy of number two. It was not number two who was depressed, but number one when he remembered number two. It was just at this time that, out of the clash of opposites, the first systemic fantasy of my life was born. It made its appearance piece by piece, and it had its origin, so far as I can remember, in an experience which stirred me profoundly. One day, a northwest wind was lashing the Rhine into foaming waves. On my way to school led along the river. Suddenly, I saw approaching from the north a ship with a great mainsail running up the Rhine before the storm. Here was something completely new in my experience, a sailing vessel on the Rhine. My imagination took wings. If instead of this swiftly flowing river, all of Alsace were a lake, we would have sailing boats and great steamers. Then Basel would be a port. It would be almost as good as living by the sea. Then everything would be different, and we would live in another time and another world. There would be no gymnasium, no long walk to school, and I would be grown up and able to arrange my life as I wished. There would be a hill or a rock rising out of the lake, connected by narrow isthmus to the mainland, cut through by a broad canal, and a wooden bridge over it, leading to a gate flanked by towers, and opening into a little medieval city built on surrounding slopes. On the rock stood a well-fortified castle with a tall keep, a watchtower. This was my house. In it, there were no fine halls or any signs of magnificence. The rooms were simple, paneled, and rather small. There was an uncommonly attractive library where you could find everything worth knowing. There was also a collection of weapons, and the bastions were mounted with heavy cannon. Besides that, there was a garrison of 50 men-at-arms at the castle. The little town had several hundred inhabitants and was governed by a mayor and a town council of old men. I myself was justice of the peace, arbitrator and advisor, who appeared only now and then to hold court. On the landward side of the town, there was only a port in which lay my two-masted schooner, armed with several small cannon. The nerve center and raison d'etre of this whole arrangement was the secret of the keep, which I alone knew. The thought had come to me like a shock, for inside the tower, extending from the battlements to the vaulted cellar, was a copper column or heavy wire cable as thick as a man's arm, which ramified at the top into the finest branches like the crown of a tree, or better still, like a taproot, with all its tiny rootlets turned upside down and reaching into the air. From the air, they drew a certain inconceivable something which was conducted down the copper column into the cellar. Here I had an equally inconceivable apparatus, kind of laboratory, in which I made gold out of the mysterious substance with which the copper roots drew from the air. This was really an arcanum of whose nature I neither had nor wished to form any conception. Nor did my imagination concern itself with the nature of the transformation process. Tactfully and with a certain nervousness, it skirted around what actually went on in this laboratory. There was a kind of inner prohibition. One was not supposed to look into it too closely, nor ask what kind of substance was extracted from the air. As Goethe said of the mothers, even to speak of them dismays the bold. Spirit, of course, meant for me something ineffable, but at the bottom I did not regard it as essentially different from very rarefied air. What the roots absorbed and transmitted to the copper trunk was a kind of spiritual essence which became visible down in the cellar as finished gold coins. This was certainly no mere conjuring trick, but a venerable and vitally important secret of nature which had come to me, I know not how, and which I had to conceal, not only from the council of elders, but in a sense also from myself. My long, boring walk to and from school began to shorten most delightfully. Scarcely was I out of the schoolhouse than I was already in the castle, where structural alterations were in progress. Council sessions were being held, evildoers sentenced, disputes arbitrated, preying on plants. Because of this unlawful activity, they were condemned to mass executions, June bugs and caterpillars being the special targets of punitive expeditions. My sympathy with all creatures was strictly limited to warm-blooded animals. The only exceptions among the cold-blooded vertebrates were frogs and toads because of their resemblance to human beings.